Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's time for another after-lunch session. It's a bit chilly in the room, but I guess we'll have a heated debate on a very broad issue of the Industrial Revolution, actually the fourth Industrial Revolution. I will just respond to that title in a second in my short introduction, but I just want to introduce you with the short scenario for the meeting and with the terrific guests we have, and I want to also thank to the organizers for inviting me for this hard work to moderate this broad topic. But I think that we're gonna with the input from the speakers and input from participants, will be able to describe the main problem, the main challenges, and maybe some main solutions, which would be my dream, of course, to finish it with in the end. So please welcome my panelists, or the members of the panel who are sitting in a different places here in the room. I just will read it from the program. So this is an order. It doesn't mean this is an order that our guest will gonna speak. I will introduce that a bit later. Well, first but not least, Ulrike Esther Franke, the policy fellow at ECFR. Welcome, Mario Mariniello, who was sitting somewhere just here is Mario. Hello. He's a digital advisor from European Political Strategy Center, and Annegret Bendiek, there, a deputy head of EU Research Division Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. So doing this short introduction, very short one, before letting you speak and discuss. My first thought when I saw the title, responding to the fourth industrial revolution, was like, again, we have to respond to something. I mean, maybe it's time to shape or create the policies and revolutions, not by responding, because especially in the digital area, I find that it's everything we discuss, it's a bit too late. So there's a revolution going somewhere. We're not really sure where and how it started, and now we're trying to responding. And that's a true problem, especially with technologies, with digital emerging digital challenges that we're gonna face. This is heavily important also, how we're to think about how we are shaping this revolution. I mean, what is the most important, what should be the most important outcome in the terms of broad topics that we can see, and those topics range from artificial intelligence, labor market, cybersecurity, cyber foreign policy, and many more. I'm aware that artificial intelligence is the most attractive part of that, but also I would like to treat the topic as a part of a tool, not a mean itself. So we're not developing artificial intelligence just to develop it and then have a nice gadget that help us to do shopping or even shape our businesses, but how it can really change the approach that we're having towards also finding a solution to the word problem, because digital is not one single technology. Digital is the set of technologies, and it's actually everywhere that we're looking around. So also please bear in mind what we think as the Industrial Revolution 4.0. If it's the name also, it's not kind of an ambush that we try to replicate those errors that humanity did in the last three revolutions. So meaning that maybe we should think much broader, that only concentrate on how the data flow would change our lives, etc. But we also should think how we should reform state, how we should reform businesses, how we should reform ourselves, not to what I'm calling digitized bureaucratic pathologies. That's I think this is the biggest challenge in the field. And when we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution, we have a set of problems, as I told at the very beginning, including those connected with artificial intelligence. And for that reason, we're going to start with talking about artificial intelligence on different levels and from different perspectives. What I really like about what our speakers will going to tell us is also that we'll concentrate on more systemic approach and trying to look how we can shape this ongoing revolution. So first, I would like to welcome Mario, who will talk about the policy challenges when it comes to artificial intelligence strategy on the European Union level. Please take the floor.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much, Krzysztof, for this nice introduction. I think you touched upon a lot of very important points. Also, thanks a lot to ECFR and Piotr and Andrei also for organizing everything and for inviting me here today. I'm not a trade, neither a development aid expert, and this morning I found the discussion extremely enriching. So I mean, I learned a lot. So thank you for that, and also thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts about these issues. As Krzysztof said, we kind of decided to focus on artificial intelligence, even though the question is broader. But artificial intelligence is a subject that encompasses pretty much everything in digital, so it's really a good starting point. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to briefly give you an overview of a paper that I wrote for the European Political Strategy Center, which is a think tank reporting directly to President Juncker. This paper was published just before the release of the strategy by the European Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and kind of contributed to the discussion. So I think it's quite. You can download it from our website. And then happy to tackle any other questions you have on digital, later on in the discussion. So I think it's fair to say from the outset that artificial intelligence is an amazing opportunity. And it is an opportunity for everybody, really, for citizens, for the public sector, for business. And above all, it's an opportunity that we cannot afford not to take. Because if we don't take it, others will, and our economy, I'm speaking from the perspective of the European Union, clearly would be doomed to succumb to our international competitors in the long term. So that is why we needed strategy, the one that was published in May by the European Commission, a strategy that would aim to from one hand, to foster the development and the uptake of artificial intelligence in Europe, and from the other hand, to address the issues that come with it. And let me stress also a very important thing, which is, because artificial intelligence markets tend to display strong economies of scale and network economies, usually a supranational level of government is the most suitable to address the issues that come with it. You have clearly, member states are coming up with their own strategies, and that is a good thing. But at the same time, it's very important to have consistency across Europe in order to achieve good results. So if you could please go ahead with the slide. So I want to talk about the benefits of artificial intelligence, simply for the sake of time. I'm happy to give references afterwards. But please just, let's say, assume that artificial intelligence can really have a huge impact on, positive impact on the economy. I will instead focus on the policy challenge. And so for me, I think the challenge number one for Europe is really with adoption. So we don't have still good statistics about artificial intelligence. That's because it's a relatively new phenomenon. But we have proxies, and we know, for example, that our economy is hardly digitized. Only 20% of companies can be said to be highly digitized. Only 1 out of 5 use some kind of cloud services. Less than 10% of small, medium enterprises do some kind of data analytics. So we are kind of far from endorsing, the digital paradigm within the economy. Next slide, please. On the supply side, we are not doing that bad. Our artificial intelligence ecosystem is quite, let's say, fertile. New companies are popping up like mushrooms, also in Europe. But we still have roughly half the companies of the US. And above all, I mean, our companies tend to struggle to get to the same level of financing that our counterparts can access to. So I mean, just to give you like a couple of figures, in the US, AI companies managed to put together up to $18 billion in terms of external financing in 2017. For the Asiatic counterparts, the figure is 10 billion. In Europe, it's 3 billion for the same period. Almost half of the total venture capital that went to AI startups globally actually accrued to Chinese companies in 2017. So, I mean, it tells us something, I think. Next slide. Now, when it comes to research, now it's clear that here China is taking the lead with more published papers in deep learning than anybody else in the world. Now, you might question, what about quality? And in fact, if you take into account self-quotation, which is a measure for quality of research, indeed, Europe and the US are still in the lead for research. But China has shown in the past to be able to achieve amazing results. Next slide. Please, thank you. So, for example, this is just an illustration, of course, but in 2015, China had developed, let's say, a Chinese company had developed the best face recognition software in the world, which was developed by Baidu, the Chinese Google. And the third one was the one that had been developed by the University of Hong Kong, just to give you like an idea. So it shows that, I mean, it can be very, very successful. Next slide, please. So what do the others have, still from the perspective of Europe, that we don't? I think there are two categories of factors. The first category is, I mean, what I call the usual suspects, and things that we tend to talk over and over about, which is Europe lacks a seamless big market. We lack the infrastructure, particularly when it comes to high-speed telecoms or computation facilities. We lack capital flow, both from private and public sector. Our research can be fantastic, really, but it tend to be quite isolated, not to have like a straightforward commercial return. So, I mean, these issues are very well known. They are not specific to artificial intelligence, but of course they matter for artificial intelligence. And the way in which we deal with them is, I mean, basically through the digital single market strategy, which I refer to in a minute. But there is let's say, one category of factor which is very specific to artificial intelligence and data, which is what I call cultural advantage. I mean, because it's fair to say that there are places in the world in which it is easier to work with data, simply because people culturally attach a, let's say, lower importance to privacy. So they are more willing, more inclined to share information about themselves. Please, next slide. So to make this point clear, I like this survey. This is something that McKinsey did in 2015. They asked drivers whether they would be willing to share the location data in order to improve the performance of their vehicles. So with car manufacturers. It turns out that by and large in Germany 65% said yes, it's fine. In the US 72%. In China the proportion is 93%. So I mean there is a structural difference, a cultural structural difference, which make it more difficult in Europe to play with data, okay, and that we have to live with. Next slide. So what is our optimal response strategy, in my view? So what you can see in the paper, let's say. First of all, we should build a framework which is supportive of artificial intelligence, and this is essentially digital single market strategy. I will touch upon it in a second. And second, perhaps kind of counterintuitively, I think we should identify and address those social risks that come with artificial intelligence and attempt to kind of set global quality standards. So we shouldn't really run after, let's say, the Chinese model. We should actually build our own model. The reason why we can do so, I believe, is twofold. First of all, because Europe has still the richest market in the world, so we still have a strong leverage that we can use for that, and I think you can see that with the GDPR, for example, the General Data Protection Regulation, which as soon as it entered into force, somehow was adopted also outside Europe. Why? Because companies clearly found it more efficient to just adopt one model across the world because it's so important to be in Europe. And the second reason, perhaps which it's a little bit more subtle, when we talk about digital, it's really about empowering the single individuals. It's all about tailoring on their preferences, on who they are somehow. So if you don't address issues that are related to individuals' single digital rights, sooner or later, issues will pop up and will explode. And we have seen a manifestation of that with the Cambridge Analytica scandal. It's just fortunate somehow that the GDPR entered into force immediately after. Actually, it would have been better, obviously, to have it already in force, so that the fine that Facebook deserved would have been higher. But still, somehow Europe didn't come unprepared. And I think my point here is really, okay, you can enjoy some short-term advantages if you forget about the ethical aspects of data use. That is undeniable, but in the long term, somehow you are doomed to face some demand instability because issues will explode sooner or later. So that's why we have to address them now. Now, quickly on the ethical, I just want to, please say that. So I think I just want to make 2 points quickly. So first of all, I think that the discussion around artificial intelligence has a little bit been hijacked by fears of substitutions. So it is legitimate, obviously, to be concerned about the effect of robots, let's say, on unemployment. However, I think it is equally important to reflect about the effect of augmentation, right? Because if artificial intelligence empowers individuals to go beyond their limits, can also empower them to do very bad things. So somehow artificial intelligence can exacerbate those power asymmetries that are already present in our society. So let's say the gap between those who have power, those who don't have it, is set to increase because of artificial intelligence. And this is a very important problem that has to be addressed. Next slide. So when it comes to, to labor, of course, we have to be concerned about those who are losing their jobs because of automation. But we should also be equally concerned about those who retain the job and about the impact that artificial intelligence will have in the relationship between employer and employees. Because, thanks to artificial intelligence, what you will have is that employers, for example, will be able to monitor employees easily just by scanning the email or even like looking at their facial expression. So, go ahead, please. And the second point that I wanted to make is that, at the end of the day, we have this important question, which is, you have a lot of data that allows you, and sophisticated algorithms, that allows you to essentially do a very, very sophisticated economic discrimination, because you can know a lot of people, essentially. Now, the question here is very subtle, because the question is an outright ban of service price personalization desirable? And the answer is no. It's very difficult to address that question, and from an economic point of view, you could say that, price discrimination doesn't have straightforward welfare effects, and you can see that with the simple example. We are happy when students or seniors are discriminated to get discounts in cinemas, for example, right? But of course, we are not happy if vulnerable categories are discriminated to go pay a higher price for the insurance if they are more likely to get sick. Clearly. So one has to, it is a very difficult question to address. What is the level of discrimination that we want to have in our society? But we can do things to, kind of diffuse the risk that discrimination is harmful for society. And one of the things that you can do, the most important one, I think, is to have functioning markets. Because if you have markets that are competitive, then the risk that discrimination will be harmful is actually much, much lower. And that's because, of course, those who are using discrimination, the suppliers, have less power in the market because they face competition. Okay, so that is very important. So the next question is, do we have functioning markets in digital? And the answer is no, we don't. So that's very good. Well, we didn't even plan it, but okay, we don't, in fact. And here is a simple example. If you look at Facebook, for example, is controlling 80% of the messaging market. And also thanks to the fact that Facebook purchased WhatsApp some time ago. So I think, this is something we should have done better from our perspective as competition policy enforcers. So I think we need to rethink our competition policy instruments in order to be able to capture more these new dynamics and address concentration in the digital landscape. Next slide. So here is a list of things that, by and large, I suggest in the paper that we should do. I'm not going to go into detail because I think I'm already over time. But you can see it in the paper. But let me just say, on the digital single market, I think what is really, really important to understand is that there are lots of initiatives that are much more boring than, let's say, than talking about artificial intelligence, but they're extremely complementary to it. And therefore, sometimes you witness this kind of schizophrenia by member states in which you have, leaders that claim that they want to invest in artificial intelligence because it's so cool to talk about artificial intelligence, but at the same time you don't get the same level of support for initiatives that are really, really fundamental for artificial intelligence to develop. Like, for example, to build, a telecom market that would foster investment in high-speed connectivity, data flow. It took a long time before the Commission would have been able to push forward an initiative to have more data flow within Europe, which is a fundamental input for artificial intelligence. So one has to get the support from member states also on that side. And then I also want, clearly skills and supporting skills, it's the creation of skills and support research in order to, kind of leverage on the economies of scale and networks within Europe is fundamental. But let me stress again the role about competition policy. We need to address the issue of potential competition. Something, you have these big companies that go on a shopping freeze, like buying small companies that can become like potential competitors in the future. At the moment, we are not able to capture that dynamics because our kind of merger control tools have been conceived in an era in which the dynamic of potential competition was much slower than what we observe today. And last slide. So I'm happy to give more details about that later. This is just a point that I wanted to make very clear. So we have a problem with merger control. The problem in Europe is under-enforcement, meaning that we have to enforce merger control more. So proposals to relax merger control in order to create European champions are very, very bad ideas, in my view. So this is just to kind of chip in, to link it to the let's say, industrial policy considerations. What we have heard lately about the proposal of indeed changing the merger control and maybe even like giving the Council the possibility to overturn the European Commission's decisions in order to have more political control, I think is really, really a bad idea. Actually, we are going in the opposite direction of where we should go. I don't have time to deal with that now because I want to leave it like the floor for the other speakers. But if you want to engage in that, I'm very happy to take your questions. And yeah, this. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for this broad introduction on the EU policy and EU market as such, or approach to the common market in that sense. I will just add, as a person who is dealing with the artificial intelligence or algorithms, I would add one important thing also, that I think we have a problem with the trust towards this kind of technologies, is the lack of transparency, or the issue of transparency as such. What we discovered in our reports on checking how does it look in Central and Eastern Europe, it says that we don't have this policy on transparency of algorithms and artificial intelligence, and this is, I guess, also the part of our European GDPR culture, that we try to be more conscious about where our data are going and what is happening to us, and what the very practical implications they got on our life. So I know also that European Union or European Commission is thinking about this topic, but I think it's also important for conscious citizens to understand the effects of artificial intelligence, and sometimes it's not easy to understand by its own creators. That's why now we are developing algorithms that explaining algorithms, because the human mind can be too narrow for understanding that. So thank you for this broad presentation. I think important for each of member state, and as we'll see later, also in terms of foreign EU foreign policy on the topic. But now let's dig into more specific AI strategies and policies in some of member states. Ulrike, please, the floor is yours.
So first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to come to Warsaw. I work for ECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations, and I'm in their London office, so it's great that Piotr invited me here. I come to this topic from a defense point of view. So my focus is on new technology in warfare. But more recently, I've broadened out a bit, mainly because one cannot discuss, AI and warfare without discussing AI more broadly. And so my first observation when I was invited to speak on this panel and read the title of the panel about the fourth industrial revolution, my immediate reaction was, oh, I haven't heard that term in a little while. Which is funny, because only about a year ago, so the fourth industrial revolution was all the rage. That was the cool hot topic in Davos at the World Economic Forum. It was being discussed, and it was really the hot term. But since then, basically the train has moved on, and we're now talking mainly about AI. And of course, these aren't exactly the same thing, but they all pertain to the same topic, which is the kind of technological disruption we are living through, or expecting, or being afraid of, really. But still, in my comments, I'll focus predominantly on artificial intelligence, and I think what I'm going to say follows quite nicely from what Mario presented. Namely, I want to talk about how Europe, and in particular how the European states, are dealing with artificial intelligence, and I'll try to open it up at the end towards cooperation with Japan, or parallels with Japan. So first, and Mario of course mentioned this, artificial intelligence is really one of those technologies that is kind of expected to influence or impact pretty much everything. AI isn't just dual use in the sense that it can be used for civilian and military applications, but it really is omni-use, as someone said. In the health sectors, AI already helps to read scans, it improves the accuracy of diagnosis. In the agricultural sector, AI helps to improve crop yields. You have factories, server farms, and other kind of energy-hungry firms or businesses that use AI to become more efficient. And of course, in defense and warfare, AI can help to be more efficient, more precise, cost-effective, but also simply to kill better. And of course, there's a whole debate about so-called killer robots or lethal autonomous weapons that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But I don't want to focus on this topic right now. Lastly, and this is important, AI will and already is geopolitically relevant because it influences economic power. Those that kind of miss the boat on AI will suffer economically, and because, as I said, it influences military power. And I'm sure you've all heard the quote from Vladimir Putin, who said that whoever controls AI will be the leader of the world, something that's being quoted all the time. That may be a bit hyperbolic, but that being said, there is a geopolitical relevance here. So how is Europe or the European states reacting? How are they thinking about AI? And what I'm going to say comes out of a study mainly where I looked at the artificial intelligence strategies, the national strategies on AI, written by Germany, by France, by Italy, though Italy doesn't have a national strategy yet, but we looked at several documents that are already out there, and we had a look, of course, at what the European Union has been writing. And I want to make 3 observations that I hope are going to be interesting. The first, when I read through these strategies, it became very clear that the European mindset with regard to AI and technological development is defensive. And I think Krzysztof put this really nicely. I mean, in theory, we shouldn't be responding, we should be shaping, right? But when you read the strategies, and this is in particular true for Germany and Italy, more so than for France, I get to this in a second, AI is being seen as something that happens to us. It's seen as a threat, you know, in terms of labor market, is seen as an inconvenience, is seen as something you need to react to, something that threatens our economic lead. And especially the German strategy, you read it, and throughout the strategy you kind of have this feeling of, we would rather not engage with this, but we kind of have to, and we're really, you know, concerned that this is going to hurt our Mittelstand, the kind of small to medium-sized German businesses. So we're going to react to this. But it's not really, you know, it's not really focused on the opportunities. I should emphasize here that the French strategy is slightly different, which has to do with the fact that the French strategy was not written, you know, by ministerial agreement, but rather by Cédric Villani, the kind of AI star and member of parliament for En Marche. And this strategy is focused more on opportunities rather than challenges, but it also has both. And of course, this has to do with something that has been mentioned by both previous speakers, or by the moderator and the speaker, which is that in Europe we tend to be more distrusting of technological developments. Partly for good reason. I think that, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. I think part of it comes from, you know, previous experiences and recent scandals, but part of it is hindering our adoption of these technologies, and the European states need to deal with this. The second observation I made when reading and analyzing these papers is that there is a clear focus on ethics, on ethical AI. The European Union actually has declared that it wants Europe to become the leader in ethical AI, which I think is great. The thing is, in order to be the leader in ethical AI, you also kind of need to be a leader in AI. And I'm not quite sure whether the strategy that we have now is really shaped in a way that guarantees this. But the ethical AI bit is very important, because what does this mean, ethical AI? Well, it focuses on transparency, as was mentioned, it focuses on security, it focuses on trust, and I think this is crucially important in order to make AI better and serve the customers better, and in order to discourage misuse, because there is enormous opportunity for misuse. Again, I'm working a lot on kind of, you know, the defense sector and killer robots, but to be quite honest, I'm way more scared of the use of artificial intelligence in surveillance by oppressive regimes than I am of being killed by a killer robot. So there's enormous possibility of misuse. So we have this focus on ethics, which I think is a good thing, but we need to make sure that it's not only ethics, but it's, you know, AI and then ethical AI, because otherwise there's nothing to this kind of ethical AI idea. The third observation, and this is something I think is really problematic, Europe in general, and this is why I emphasized this at the beginning, Europe in general doesn't consider AI an element of geopolitical power. This is something that is very rarely mentioned, and the impact of AI on geopolitical power is neglected. Partly because many countries don't want to engage with this idea of AI in the military. They just feel that, you know, it's a bit icky, and again, the killer robots debate, so we rather don't want to engage with it. Partly because Europe as an actor, or the EU as an actor, isn't exactly a geopolitical, doesn't exactly consider itself a geopolitical player, though maybe it should. Once again, this was particularly visible in the German and the Italian strategy, not really surprising. In the French strategy, you had a bit more geopolitical thinking, also because military wasn't completely excluded. But I think this is concerning because we may not think of AI as a geopolitical power element, but the other geopolitical powers actually are. I mentioned Putin, of course, but also when you look at the recent US executive directive that was just a few weeks ago published, it is very clear that AI is being seen as a geopolitical power element. So just because we don't want to go down that road doesn't mean that others aren't. And maybe one final point on this comparison, what I thought was really interesting when you looked at whether these states are thinking on a European level or on a national, is you weirdly have both, and it's not quite clear. Because on the one hand, European cooperation is mentioned many times, but at the same time, these strategies are actually quite nationalistic. So the German strategy is called AI made in Germany. The French strategy is called towards a French and European strategy. And it's very much about, you know, these countries becoming leader in AI, and then as a kind of second idea, it's, oh yeah, and also Europe. So I'm not sure it's quite clear yet, and I think this is something that the European Union may wanna look at. So that's on this kind of, you know, just a few observations on these strategies. What about cooperation with other players? We are here, of course, to talk about also cooperation with Japan, and so I had a look at what they say about cooperating with other players, not just European. So the German strategy doesn't mention Japan by name, but it mentions quite specifically the possibility of working with the G7 and G20 countries and certain Asian countries, which I thought was a very interesting way to put it. I'm not quite sure whether they meant Japan or China or whether they just wanted to leave it open, but there's certainly a way to cooperate. And France also mentions Japan as a potential AI leader. And I do think that there is generally room to work with countries that have similar values and possibly similar concerns. Because I do think, and that's almost my last point, I do think that there are quite a few parallels between Europe's situation when it comes to AI and Japan's. So both countries, if you call Europe a country, are caught between the United States and China, right? So Europe has a major concern of becoming an AI colony. This is actually something you can find in the strategies. They're very concerned about falling behind technologically and being increasingly pushed around by both players. And we've seen this with Huawei, that the US is really putting pressure on Europe now, and Europe kind of feels that it is caught between the two big players here. And I think Japan is in a similar situation as Europe with regard to many of these things. I mean, of course, first of all, there are the obvious parallels of, you know, Japan also being a high-tech country that is kind of doing reasonably well with regard to AI, but it is not, you know, one of the major leaders, and it's also comparatively small, you know, compared to the US or China. And with regard to AI, not being a leader is actually problematic because, as with many of these technological developments, there is a risk that this is a winner-takes-all market, right? So it doesn't matter whether you come in second because it's the winner that takes all. And this is a concern that both Europe and Japan share. Japan is also caught between the US and China, of course, you know, with the US being the most important partner in general with regard to security, and China being a very close by neighbor and concern. So I think that there may be some room for cooperation. This is really where I would love to hear more about the Japanese thinking. So I know that Japan published its AI strategy actually rather early, in March 2017, so way earlier than the other European countries. And Japan also, just as a funny side note, gave residency in Japan to a chatbot boy. So Japan is certainly good in, AI PR, if you like. But most importantly, what I've seen is that Japan is also focused on ethics, on privacy. And as I mentioned, this really is one of those things that Europe is focusing on. And so my pitch, in a way, would be that this is something where Japan, Europe, and other like-minded countries can try to work together. There are, big markets and highly developed markets, and can try and should develop rules together in order to avoid, abuse. As I mentioned, surveillance is absolutely terrifying, and in that way they could strengthen both their economies and their research on AI, but also do some more general good, which is something the European Union is always quite concerned of. And so I'll stop here, and I really would like to hear the thoughts, especially from the Japanese participants, on whether these kind of corporations is something that makes sense to you and would be something that you are interested in. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, we will have a chance to, after the next speaker, also to hear His Excellency, Mr. Ambassador of Japan to Poland on that. But let's move to the supranational level. I mean, apart from that, there are some countries that we heard that thinking that AI strategy can be based on the national level, which also gives me a question when we talking about the leaders in AI. I mean, should we really talk about countries, or there are companies that are far, far beyond any borders, actually? So that's there's also another challenge for shaping policy, actually. What does it mean that Germany or Poland or any other country have a good AI strategy? When it comes to the business, it might not be relevant, fortunately or unfortunately, in this manner. So also coming on that, I agree with this connection between Japan and again, this is important from my human rights perspective. The common feelings about privacy and GDPR. In fact, there is a deal of some sort of a similar regulation in Japan. This might be a future, but I'm not an expert yet. Let's hear an expert, Annegret, from to hear about the EU, Japan, and the country in between, China, a bit. Let's touch on that. There's a big discussion also on Huawei and its role in Western democracies. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to ECFR and Piotr for inviting me and having the chance to present here some thoughts about EU-Japan relations as a dependent variable of EU-China and EU-US relations. Because when we look, I think, at digital geopolitics on a global scale, it is very important that we distinguish between what we call the three different layers of internet governance. So we look at the content layer, we look at the code layer, and we look at the physical layer. And as you have heard about the developments in artificial intelligence, strategy building, I think this is only one topic. We have other trends within this relationship between EU, US, China relations. It is also, when we look at the physical layer, it's about a broadband connectivity, including with the emerging 5G wireless network. We look at the Internet of Things. We look at the blockchain technology. And at least, of course, we look at artificial intelligence, what we called in the past big data analysis. When we looked, or we thought about at the Institute, how we can look at social scientists to EU external relations within this phase of digitization. And we thought, okay, it makes sense to apply artificial intelligence for our own analysis. So we got in contact with Deloitte Analytic Center, with the Center of the Long View of Deloitte, and we applied artificial intelligence technology to our own social scientist analysis. And the combination of artificial intelligence and human intelligence has led to a total of 4 scenarios which have been carried out on the 2 axes of techno-political integration or fragmentation on the one hand, and resilience or vulnerability on the other. And only one of the 4 scenarios we have been looked at, so responding to the industrial revolutions and the EU external relations towards China and the US, described a positive vision. So, and this is called Sophie's world. So, and this Sophie's world assumes that global political, economic, and technological integration continues to progress, and that resilience will be a dominant feature of modern societies, and that multilateral negotiations will lead to a global order. So cooperation and prosperity will continue to spread. But that is only one very unique positive scenario. However, 2 less optimistic scenarios were assessed as more likely. And like Sophie's world, the collapse of the digital commons scenario assumes a high degree of technical and economic integration, but combines this with low political integration and a resulting high degree of social vulnerability. So in this world, the markets of Europe, China, and the US are integrated, and also Japan, but at the same time, they cause high social upheavals and a division of European societies into groups of varying intensity of socio-technical monitoring and protection of privacy. So public goods such as social peace and democracy tend to be underproduced. The scenario Cold War 4.0 was rated as similarly probable. It describes a world in which national society has become highly vulnerable to cyber attacks, and in which the state's attempt to hide behind high digital walls has failed. So mistrust is omnipresent, world trade is declining, and arms control is running empty. But the interesting thing is that most of our participants which took part at our scenario workshop voted in favor of the 4th scenario, the most likely scenario, which was described as unsplendid isolation. So it combines global socio-technical fragmentation with high social resilience. So in this world, the 3 large blocs, USA, China, and Europe, are hiding behind increasingly impenetrable digital walls, competing globally for increasing scarce resources, because they are protectionist, and waging digital proxies wars in the rest of the world. Here too, global commons are underproduced. The digital revolution does not lead to a better world of unhindered communication and peaceful transnational socialization, but rather to new conflicts and nationalism. So it is true, I think, that AI technology, as we have been applied, and expert knowledge in combination, this method we use cannot give a reliable answer to the question of probability of one or of the 4 scenarios describing. The future is uncertain, and we cannot predict even with the best method. However, I think we must be considered impressive and alarming that 3 of the 4 scenarios are rather describing a gloomy world. All three scenarios also assume that international cyber diplomacy will fail to achieve sustainable cooperation between the US, China, and Europe. And the digital revolution is therefore far from being able to give us confidence that old conflicts will be transformed into a future harmony. So what is the lesson learned here also for this seminar? I think it is worthwhile to have a stronger look at different formats of multilateral cooperation. And of course, the EU-Japan relationship here is a very important one, because I think we as democratic multilateral partners within international relations can strengthen cyber diplomacy, can strengthen security and trust-building measures in order to prevent these 3 negative scenarios which we have been described in our scenario building. So I think this is very important because it's the future that is in our hand, and I think this Japan-EU relationship showed very much, for example, also when we looked at the free trade agreement and the future investment agreement, that we will apply the strongest data protection regulation framework worldwide within this relationship. And here I would like to argue in a different sense that the EU is already a norm taker and a norm shaper. And a norm shaper in the sense that with the general data protection framework regulation, we are limiting artificial intelligence, or the implementation and the application of artificial intelligence in this sense, but also we are controlling it more. We are trying to regulate the implementation and the application of AI technology. And therefore, privacy by design, security by design, this is, I think, the future to go also for the EU-Japan relations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this part. And now, as we are turned to discuss also the EU-Japan relations, it's my pleasure to invite the Ambassador of Japan to Warsaw to present his or his government views on artificial intelligence. And it would be also especially interested in the context of the connection there is between EU and Japan in terms of developing and maybe regulating artificial intelligence. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure I can respond to your expectation, but anyway, I listened to the intervention by various orators very carefully, very interestingly. And I feel that we are now facing a big challenge, but at the same time, we are facing a big chance, opportunity to create a new society. And I think that originally a speaker from Japan was supposed to participate in this session and to explain the policy and strategy of the Japanese government. But since he's absent, instead of him, I'll touch upon briefly the policy that government Japan is now taking in this field, particularly in cooperation with private sectors. The government Japan decided about 3 years ago in its cabinet decision that Japan would aim at so-called Society 5.0. But it's a new word. We think that Society 5.0 is supposed to be a futuristic society that will come after the present digital information society, that is Society 4.0. It is a developing idea, developing concept, where it needs more explanation. But in a nutshell, it is a kind of 35.0 is a kind of human-centered society which balances economic advancement with resolution of social problems which our society is now facing, such as aging population, which is a quite crucial problem for our Japanese society, or gaps between regions, ages, gender, language, or environmental energy issues. So we'd like to achieve this society by using the modern technology, which you have just mentioned, such as IoT, Internet of Things, or AI, or mass data, or robotics. Actually, probably, if I may say so, it is a very comprehensive concept. It is more than just the improvement of productivity with the use of modern technology. We think that we can we can create a new society where we will be able to better manage all social problems we are now facing using new technologies. Probably we are a bit optimistic, but we are aiming at kind of society which combines or which integrate, in a sense, cyberspace and the physical space. Sorry, I'm not an expert in this field, but it is the word used in the brochure of the Japanese government. So I don't enter into the detail. But anyway, we are now discussing with other countries. We are ready to discuss with European countries and other countries to develop this idea. But our idea is to really try to create a new society, new futuristic society, where we can benefit from the advancement of that technology. All parties should benefit from the advancement of technology. But we have, of course, we have a negative side. But we would like to think positively how to use this modern digital technology to improve our society. So that's our concept. Sorry, I'm not an expert, so I cannot enter into detail, but it is based on this idea. Now we are discussing with other countries how to develop a new society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I think also like what we heard was really important in the terms of the using of the word society and how it influences society and how we approach that society is living somewhere in between cyberspace and reality, and that's also a tremendous point for that. So I'm just now will open the floor for discussion. I think we have like 25 minutes around that. Just some points that because again the topic is very broad. Some points that I heard that we can try to arrange our discussion around. There's a question of regulation and policies, and in the context of national and supranational approach to that, and three other issues which are of course connected, or they are part of these broader issues of regulation and policies, which is an influence on market, security, and society. So this is something that our discussion, the previous discussion from our speakers came from, and I'm welcome you to ask the questions or make comments now. And please, when you're doing it, present yourself. I guess it's important also for the streaming. Thank you.
Thank you. I have questions. I am not an expert on this issue, so I found the presentations very useful. Thank you very much. I have a few questions. First, I guess it was very interesting to know that the healthy development of a digital society or economy depends on trust. And here, I guess supranational maybe regime is the issue that I'm, I guess, trying to question. Europe, EU, and Japan we've been saying that they share common fundamental values such as human rights and so on. But there are other groups of countries which do not share the same fundamental value. But especially, of course, I don't have to say some country because we are talking about China mainly here. But China has an advantage in developing IT-related society, in my view, because of a very strict control of information and so on. I'm thinking about like auto-driving kind of a city, which I guess China is trying to experiment. That can be done because the privacy is not really well protected. So how should a country like EU countries and Japan respond to this kind of challenge? In terms of technological progress, as I said earlier, China has advantage in developing new technology, new IT-centered economy or society, as opposed to like us, which do not have a comparative advantage. How do we deal with that issue? And another question that I have is the economies of scale, which can be described for the like IT-related industry. And of course, we can benefit. We as a people can benefit if everybody uses the same framework or same technology. But that, of course, leads to monopoly, and that is a problem that was pointed out. So how do we deal with this say benefits which may arise from using one common standard, but which at the same time leads to monopoly? How can we come up with a proper framework to deal with this issue? And finally, AI can be a very good technology for a country like Japan and maybe some European countries which are experiencing declining population and so on, to substitute people by AI, robots. But what about the developing countries? If, say, multinational corporations, they are used to use AIs, and of course, some developing countries like to maybe adopt AI just to show that they can do it. That leads to maybe a lot of unemployment of people in developing countries. So I just wonder how this AI will affect the employment in developing countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. What I propose is just collect some questions and some comments, and then I will ask by the end our panelists to respond if we still have some questions and comments. Please.
My question is on international cooperation for developing kind of global standards for artificial intelligence. I'm curious to hear the panelists' view on whether EU should push for provisions within its trade agreements in future negotiations to include some clauses or guidelines on ethical AI, or whether it would like to continue separating negotiations on privacy and digital economy from the standard tariff reductions or non-tariff barriers. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions by now or comment? Oh.
Thank you very much. My name is Marta Makowska. I'm from Polish Institute of International Affairs, but I was formerly involved with ECFR Warsaw, so it's always a pleasure to come to ECFR events. I have a small observation because I myself also did some research on the AI and the European Union's attitude towards it. And first of all, I think that the EU should not be involved into so-called race in their leadership in artificial intelligence, because first of all, I still find it hard to find the definition. What does the leader in artificial intelligence mean? Is it money spent on the research, on ventures in artificial intelligence? Is it the number of patents? registered in particular countries. Number of regulations is the actually the size of the market of the companies. What I'm saying is that actually the EU should pick up and get involved into these society-oriented, as it was said before, citizens-oriented approach to artificial intelligence, and focus on possibly well-being of societies by, for example, investing in medicine, in public services, and so on. Because I think in the race which involves money, we will be lagging behind China and USA. And I also think that we can reshape a little bit our debate on the ethics of artificial intelligence, because we can as well call it debate on actually legal norms of AI functioning, so that they don't break the right to privacy of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Here I see the will to speak. Yes?
Thank you. A few short questions. One to Mr. Marinielli on an invitation basically to expand on where you ended on competition policy 4.0 and industrial policy, because I think you were referring to that proposal that came out last week by Germany and France, and how that's a bad idea and how that relates to the discussion here. I would love to hear a little bit more. That, to any speaker that feels well, the urge to answer, on standard setting and norm setting and EU-Japan cooperation more specifically. The two things that I would love to hear your thoughts on. The data protection area that EU and Japan basically created was announced just a few weeks ago that we're finally here. Is that one stepping stone or is it not, in your view? And then, of course, the export control, what is it called? Export Control Reform Act that the United States basically unilaterally launched in December last year as a sort of an attempt to also well, increase export controls to regulate dual use and use of emerging technologies, disruptive ones. Can the EU and Japan develop a joint response to that? Because I think we both agree that what the EU the US is proposing there in a very broad brush policy is not going to fly as such, but we also probably agree on the need that something has to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. And what I propose is taking the last questions or comment and then come back to the speakers, because there are already quite a lot of questions. And then if the time allows, we will come back to the discussion. Please.
Okay, thank you. Sebastian Dolin from the European Council on Foreign Relations. I would like to play the devil's advocate for industrial policy here for a change, especially for digital industrial policy. And this is based on discussions we had at the ECFR. I mean, you said Europe should try to high standards of data protection, unique selling proposition, and try to develop their own internet, at least large viable companies doing that. I think there's nothing wrong with it. I just don't think it will work alone. And the reason is, I mean, ask yourself, why don't we have internet giants now? It's not because of that there's something lacking in the single digital market. It is just because that most of the fields have been covered by US internet giants, and whenever a European technology comes up, they buy it up. I mean, Skype was one of the examples. Skype developed to a certain point, and then Microsoft grabbed it up. And I don't think you are going to change that at all, because these internet giants, they sit on a giant pile of cash, and they're going to buy all new technologies from Europe, at least unless we have an internet giant of our own in Europe. So the question really is, I mean, and this is economics. These are economies of scale markets, and once you have been there, there's no economic logic how you can displace Google. If you just want to replicate the server farms of Google, you need a medium-sized double-digit billion-dollar investment. So the question is, what can you do? And I would say we really should think about some kind of, probably not merger control. I think the Alstom-Siemens thing is completely misguided. But what we proposed at ECFR is saying, well, let's do the following. We introduce a rule which says whenever a company is giving personal data of a EU citizen to a foreign government or government agency without a EU court order, they are fined $200,000 for each case, or 200,000 euros. And the result, of course, would be that some of the internet giants would move away from Europe. You would see someone else establishing the infrastructure in Europe, and you would get the capabilities we don't have. I mean, in server technology, in cloud computing, we are, 5 to 10 years behind Google, and we don't even have the engineers here. So that's, well, you were already shaking your head, so I think you're probably opposed to that, but I would like to hear your views on some more aggressive policies here. Thanks.
Thank you. I guess 200,000 is not a lot for giants, but still,
well,
I understand the point.
Per case is that's quite relevant, because we have 300 million people living here, and if the NSA goes through the files, that easily adds up.
Thank you for that. So, who's gonna start? Mariam? Okay.
Great questions. I mean, I tried to list all of them, and I mean, it would take a day to reply to all of them. So I'll try to be quick, but bear with me a couple of minutes. So starting from the first one, how do you respond to the challenge that, I mean, like, indeed, you know, as I pointed out, there is a structural difference in the, in the cultural approach. I mean, there is an advantage, intrinsic advantage in China. As I said, I think we have to develop our own way of dealing with this, and I wanted to make a reference to the effect of the GDPR. I think it's true that in the short term, you know, this might have somehow some costs to bear, also in the development of artificial intelligence. But in the medium and long term, you might also expect some benefits. And the reason is because, I mean, like, you are changing the rules of the game, and I mean, companies will adapt necessarily. So, for example, you have, you know, innovative solutions that keep, you know, the data closer to the data subject. I don't know if you've ever heard about PIMS, Personal Information Management System. You know, the idea is like essentially you don't lose control of your data. And this, I mean, like, is kind of pushed. You know, this innovation is pushed by the GDPR somehow. So you are, I mean, like, you can. It's not so straightforward that if you put more constraints, then you necessarily are disadvantaged. You just change a little bit the field. I can't develop too much on this, but I'm happy to talk about that later, maybe on a bilateral basis. You said, I mean, how do we exploit economies of scale? Well, I mean, this is a very old question. It's about natural monopolies. How do you deal with the natural monopolies? Well, it's a mix. I mean, in this case, it's a mix of, you know, competition policy instruments, but also regulation. And so, for example, I mean, like, you foster interoperability. If you foster interoperability, you might be able to still capture economies of network economies while still retaining, you know, more competition. So that's a little bit the thinking you have. It's a mix of the two things. On developing countries' effect of employment. This might be huge, the effect. I mean, I don't know. I mean, like, the detail, but what I know in general is that, I mean, I tend to be quite optimistic, let's say, on the effect of employment in the long term, but there are transitional costs that have to be addressed, and this cost might be higher for developing countries. So one has to take that in mind. But still, I mean, like, what you observe in general is that there is a change in the natural jobs more than a net loss. So, you know, I mean, I don't think the long-term effects would be negative. Push for ethical in trade agreement. I see that was your question. I'm not sure. I mean, it's a very, very interesting. I don't know really how to reply. I think I like very much what Sebastian mentioned earlier this morning, which is, you know, you also have to consider how this, affects society somehow, and sometimes, you might even decide to disentangle these issues in order not to have them to hijack the process, like it was done in the case of the investment screening. So I like that as well. On not be involved in the leader race, I see your point. I mean, like, but again, I mean, like, the involvement of society is, yeah, I mean, like, it was not really a question, so I suggest, and I agree with that. So I expand on Alstom and Siemens, and then I close on my side. though it's very long. So how do you, I mean, first of all, one should be clear that merger control, I mean, having also Siemens to trigger this, all this discussion on merger, it's really misleading. If you think about it, you know, in the last 10 years, we had 3,000 mergers that have been adopted by, you know, cleared, sorry, by the European Commission. Just 9 were the prohibitions. So, I mean, just to now hijack the discussion with Alstom Siemens to trigger a change in merger control for me is, I mean, it's just absurd. One should look at the big picture. At the end of the day, it's a factual assessment. So, what is the European Commission doing, or any antitrust authority? Essentially, is to check what is the effect on, you know, on the economy. I mean, technically, is on effect on consumer or customer surplus. Okay, but I mean, essentially what you're doing is like a balancing exercise. You look at, you know, of course, if you increase concentration in the market, I mean, like you have negative effects on prices, but on the other hand, you might have like efficiency that offset those negative effects. And so, you know, it's a factual assessment. Now, the Commission has done that factual assessment, and you know, it turns out that they decided that these efficiencies do not arise, and the concentration is quite strong. So you will have negative effects on the European economy. So because Alstom and Siemens are upstream somehow, no, in the economy. So there are companies that buy from Alstom and Siemens in Europe. So, you know, you can question the factual assessment of the Commission, but that you have to do it at a later stage, not now, because there are no public information. So, you know, outside. So, I mean, the nature of the questioning of the decision is not factual, because the facts are not there yet. So, basically, let's assume that the facts are correct. So the question is then, do we want to accept a negative effect on our economy in order to have a European champion? And for me, the answer is clearly no. I mean, why? I want the European economy to be developed. It's not just a question of pride. I mean, if you look at the economic literature, there are plenty of indications that competition is probably the best instrument we have to push for growth, because competition is pushing companies to be more efficient, because otherwise don't survive in the market, because competition is selecting out companies that are inefficient, so those who are not good, I mean, they are pushed out to the market, and therefore, in the long term, the market is simply more efficient. You know, I mean, it's pushing to innovate, because, I mean, if you have too much competition, then you need to look for other markets where you can make or create new markets where you can make profits. So, I mean, there are so many beneficial effect with competition that you would basically lose just by saying, okay, let's just you know, relax merger control. But of course, it's a very long topic. So, I mean, I'm also happy to engage with you later if you want about this. And finally, on your point, so, well, I mean. I think the best way to deal with these issues is by improving our competition policy tools and move away from, you know, this kind of old school, more price-centric approaches that is like inherited from, if you want, from the past. What I mean is that when you have a merger that is taking place, you also have to consider effects on the quality of product, which, I mean, you normally do. But in this case, you also have to include in quality also privacy, for example, also the protection of data. So, you know, what you could say is that if, you know, an American company which has which is likely to abuse data of European citizens is buying a European company. And so during this factual assessment, you come up with the conclusion that the risk is of abuse for European citizens is high. That effectively boils down to a reduction in quality of the product. And therefore, that is already enough to suggest that you should prohibit the merger, or at least impose conditions that mitigate that risk. So, I mean, like, you see, I mean, like, I think there are I mean, what I would like to do, and again, I'm sorry, I mean, because I'm taking so much time, then we can discuss as well, but I think we shouldn't be emotional about this, let's say, these problems. I think we have to find sophisticated answers to sophisticated problems.
Thank you. Annegret, please.
Thank you. I would really agree to Mario's statement, but from a different perspective. I think it is fair to ask, what is the future role within this multipolar world the EU can play? And we are all convinced that the EU should go for a third way. But I'm not so convinced if it is really very sensitive and sensible that we go for industrial policy in order to shape this third way. Why? Because the internal market was successful, or is successful, because of 4 principles. That is a strong role for supranational institutions such as the European Commission, and competition policy, trade policy is in the hand of the European Commission and not in the hand of Joe Kaiser, of the Siemens CEO, or of Allianz, or of these German big stock market industry companies, yes? And therefore, this is one principle. The other principle is mutual recognition. So that we compete within the internal market on the same level, and we are open for third country multinational companies as long as they apply the market principle, so the lex loci within in our single European market. Then we have a strong ruling by the European Court of Justice. So we are a community by law, and therefore industrial policy contradicts totally to these principles of the functioning of the single market. That is also the reason why I sometimes, what I learned in European law and in European politics in the past, why we have European integration in this sphere. And then that is also what I always explain when I'm together with my Polish colleagues talking about European integration. That I think really the respect for the decision coming out of the European Commission and supranational institutions is a principle for European integration. Because once you start to question really on a constitutional level the outcome and the decision taken by majority voting by the European Commission, you are in a similar situation as in a constitutional crisis. Secondly, open standards for artificial intelligence. As far as I know, we see now the next round of the governmental expert group on the UN level talking about norms and for state behavior in cyberspace. And I think it is I'm not very optimistic that we find in these 2 different negotiation rounds, one is led by Russia and China and the other by the US and the Europeans and like-minded states, that we find a solution. But interestingly, we observe already that there are some emerging countries, so-called emerging countries like Brazil or Argentina or other countries that are more in favor of a compromise between these different negotiation rounds. And therefore, it might be a possible way to find agreed common open standards and also with an ethical application of artificial intelligence that we can agree on a UN level. But I'm not very optimistic, but I think it is worthwhile to look at these third countries like Brazil and looking at their stance on this issue. And yes, so competition policy, I think, is the most complicated thing what we have in the European Union, and therefore I'm really much in favor of more independent research that we should conduct on this policy, and we should not really argue in this political crisis situation with short-term answers. I think we need a longer view on this challenge. Thank you.
I'm sorry, unfortunately we don't have AI windows for that. Okay, so the last comment from Ulrike Franke, and I see that some of you already want to talk or discuss or battle the arguments you have. We'll have a time for that during the break. Don't kill the messenger. Organizers just asking me also to keep the time, but for sure we will discuss it more in coming months and years. Ulrike, please.
Yes, and I'll keep my comments very short. I just wanted to make 2 points. Number one, because China was mentioned. So it was said that, China doesn't share our values, but it is a leader in AI. And just kind of to give you an idea. So in my mind, there are 3 things that you need to have to develop artificial intelligence, right? It's talent, it's data, and it's computing power. When you look at talent, China is leading just behind the US, I would say. It doesn't attract as much talent as the US does. The US really attracts talents worldwide, but it is rather good at educating its own people. It has a long history of math training and language training and all of that. That's really helpful with AI. So it's doing good in terms of talent. In terms of data, China is the leader, really. I mean, of course, the US has Google and Facebook and all of that have a lot of data, but these aren't really US companies as such. They are global companies. It's not as if the US as a country has direct access to this. So it's a bit more tricky for the US. China, I think The Economist was it who called China the Saudi Arabia of data. Why is this? Because China has an enormous population from which it can more or less, I'm generalizing, but more or less take its data as it likes, because it's an authoritarian regime, has very few rules on data privacy. We've also heard that the Chinese population is actually more okay with this than the European, or if they aren't okay with this, they don't have a choice in the first place. And also something that's rather important, China is starting to have global cooperations with other countries. So you may have seen that China is now operating facial recognition software in Zimbabwe or in Nicaragua, which is not only, kind of great business opportunity for them, but also allows them to get, facial recognition data from non-Chinese people, which helps their eye as well. So in terms of data, China is definitely a major leader. And then on the last bit, the kind of computing power and chips, so far China is actually still rather dependent on the US and on US firms, as pretty much the whole world is. This is changing somewhat. It becomes really technical here, so I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around this. But overall, China is doing reasonably well, but still somewhat dependent, and the US is actually playing on that dependence to slow down Chinese AI development a bit. So how should we respond to this kind of growing power towards the East? So number one, and this has been said a few times, I really do think that having rules for our own markets that external companies, for instance, that want to enter these markets need to follow is something that's very important and can work. So that is something the EU already is looking at and should look more at. But there's another element we haven't really talked about much, and this is I was talking about the importance of data, right? At the moment, most AI works in a way that you have massive amounts of data and feed the AI with it, and the AI learns from this. That's one way to do artificial intelligence, but there are others. And I've been wondering whether it wouldn't make sense for Europe, for the European Union, for European countries, to start focusing more on those types of AI that actually don't need that much data. And there are AI systems that work with reinforcement learning rather than other types of machine learning. Where that is possible. So I'm thinking that maybe in terms of technical solutions to our so-called problems, such as data privacy, that there could be a way to respond to that. And maybe, and very briefly, a second point on what Marta said about joining the AI race. I feel like I'm in the cinema or something. So on joining the AI race, so I'm all for Europe focusing on the well-being and ethics and all of that, but I'm wondering how can we be a leader in well-being and ethical AI if we aren't a leader in AI? And so I would think that we actually kind of have to join this race, otherwise we won't be able to influence it. And I'll stop here before the curtains start opening and closing again. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. We probably will open during the breaks. You'll have more sun. Thank you very much. Personally, what I really am happy about is that I feel that it's not the moment that we had 2-3 years ago in the discussions, like we're doomed, there's an artificial intelligence and we don't know what's that. Now we more understand how does it work, what are the main challenges, and actually we don't have only ideas how to tackle those challenges and risk, but I heard some good solutions here on the floor. And this is an ongoing debate, as the artificial intelligence is an ongoing product or a tool or a mean. So I'm very happy to hear personally also your opinions on that. And of course the discussion itself is much broader, and it's cross-sectoral, cross-communal, and can be done from different angles and directions. Thank you for thinking about this session, and I think we not only respond to the fourth industrial revolution, but we try to shape there and create some new points. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Krzysztof, and thank you to all of you for this very rich day of discussions on various topics related to the EU-Japanese relations, and of course, in a wider global context. I'm not going to wrap up this day because this is not the end. We will have a public event in half an hour, which is meant to perhaps to some extent summarize the discussions, but also to broaden them and discuss the implications for both the European Union and Japan of all that what has been discussed here. So I will limit myself just to a few words of thank you to the moderators, to the panelists, and to all our partners, and last but not least to Andrzej Mendel-Nikorowicz, who is somewhere here, hopefully. Hopefully he hears me. He was the mastermind behind the whole conference, and I think he also deserves some applause for what he has done in terms of organization, logistics, and so on. So thank you very much, and I kindly invite you for the public event in 30 minutes.